Hello, and welcome everybody to our webinar. This is a quick guide to ADA drinking fountain compliance. Our goal today is going to be to take an in-depth look at the ADA standard, its requirements, and how it affects the installation and the design of drinking fountains. Many of the requirements I'm about to go over with you apply to more than just drinking fountains, but drinking fountains will be our primary focus today. My name is Justin Dunn. I'm the product specialist slash trainer for Haas. I've been here for about 4 years. With me is Samantha Hoke, who is our marketing communications strategist. And also with me is Kelly Guilfoy with Specification Sales. He is our guest panelist today and an expert on the ADA standard. Exactly what I'm trying to be, but that's why we're holding this webinar. So feel free to post questions at any time during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the link at the top here to help sort those out. All attendees will be on mute for the entire presentation. We wouldn't want people talking over each other, blurting out questions. I have a blurting out question section of the webinar that you can participate in by using the question section on your control panel. So Kelly, Sam, and I, and Lex, who is also joining us, will answer these at the end of the presentation. Mostly be Kelly, though. So feel free to submit at any point during the presentation. Any unanswered questions will be answered in a follow-up email that will also have this recording and a PDF of the slides for your reference. So like I said, 24 or 48 hours after the presentation, wait for that email. You'll get that on-demand recording, the presentation slides, and some additional support materials to help you. Just to give you a quick little history on Haas, our founder was Luther Haas. He invented the modern drinking fountain in 1906 and formed the Haas Sanitary Drinking Faucet Company in 1901, Berkeley, California. And this history with hydration has kind of uniquely situated us to provide you with information regarding compliance, especially with our history with ADA and providing accessible fountains. Fun fact, Luther was working as a sanitary inspector for Berkeley when he noticed children drinking from and sharing a tin cup in the schoolyard, and that they were filling their water from a spigot, which is gross, and constructed the first bubbler head by drilling a hole into his brass bedpost, you know, that little ball on the top. And it was kind of all downhill from there. So our agenda today includes an overview of the ADA legislation pertinent to drinking fountains, ADA installation issues commonly encountered in the field. I'll go over quite a few examples with you. And then Haas products demonstrating ADA compliance for both fountains and for bottle fillers. Okay, and then Samantha, if you would launch poll question number 1, I'd really appreciate it. We're going to launch several of these. We really appreciate your feedback.
Thank you, Justin. Before we move forward, we would like to know what your role is when it comes to drinking fountains. If none of these are applicable, please do not respond. Do you select the product? Do you specify the product? Do you purchase it, install it, or maintain it? As we go through each of these polls, there will be a little bit of silence. I'm going to allow everybody about 45 seconds to answer, and then we will move on. Thank you. Great, thank you for participating. Back to you, Justin.
Okay, now the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed by Congress on July 26, 1990. It was signed into law by George H.W. Bush and gave reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and prohibited discrimination based on disabilities. There would not have been an ADA without the disability rights movement. Justin Dart would have been proud. Give it a Google. The ADA is enforced by the Department of Justice, who have filed hundreds of lawsuits over the years enforcing civil rights legislation. At its worst, a lawsuit can do some serious damage monetarily, not to mention damaging a company's reputation on top of that. And at a minimum, noncompliance can mean reinstallations, which can be pretty costly. With that said, let's get into it. Remember this one, 29 CFR Part 36, Title 3, regarding public accommodations and commercial facilities is going to be our focus today. The following are the key sections of the standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. Also remember that Sam is going to send out these slides to everyone after the presentation so you can reference them later, so don't get too stressed out with notes or anything like that if you're worried. This section of 36.403, this gives us a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility to a facility. You will notice that in this list, drinking fountains takes a pretty high priority, even over accessible parking. So as you can see, along with restrooms and telephones, which is kind of an odd one nowadays when your telephone is typically in your pocket, but there are still payphones and public phones out there for emergencies. But access to water is very important. So up until the 2010 ADA standards, children were often an afterthought when accessible conditions were considered. But with this update, we now have, as stated above, technical requirements based on children's dimensions and anthropometrics for drinking fountains. Anthropometrics is just a fancy way of saying measurements of the human body without using 5 words. Children are designed as age 12 or younger in the ADA. And I'll go over quite a few examples later of child height fountains, bottle fillers, and stuff like that a bit later on in the presentation. The ADA requires that wherever a fountain is required, that there be one high fountain and one low fountain. It is local building code that determines the load capacity of the building and the required number of drinking fountains, not the ADA, which is a common misconception. ADA simply stipulates that there must be 2 fountains, one for people with stooping abilities and may require crutches, canes, or walkers, and one for those of us who need a wheelchair. It might be weird to think of it this way, but drinking fountains are not designed or installed in any way for able-bodied people. And that is because it's reasonable to think that an able-bodied person could use whatever fountain installed at whatever height. Now, if you have a building that requires one drinking fountain on the first floor, the ADA requirements override this. 2 fountains are required, but they don't in any way have to be located next to each other. You could have a high fountain on one end of a corridor and the low side at the other end of the corridor. As long as there are 2 fountains, one high and one low, they are typically found near each other and typically next to like restrooms, facilities, and stuff like that. This section of the ADA is referred to as the 50-50 rule. When more fountains than the minimum required amount are provided, half have to be a high fountain and half must be a low fountain. For example, if you had 8 fountains you were installing, you couldn't do 6 high and 2 low. You would have to provide 4 high and 4 low, an even amount, 50-50. Except where the amount of fountains you're installing yields a fraction. So in the same scenario, if we had 8 fountains, 4 high and 4 low, and we added another fountain, we have the choice to make that either a high or a low fountain, giving us either 5 high or 4 low or 4 high and 5 low. The choice is yours. One exception to this is that when a building has less than 15 occupants, or when there is a restaurant or a bar serving water, there is no fountain required, but it's always best to check with your local codes first. Chapter 3 talks about dimensional and mechanical elements. You will hear the word elements a lot in the ADA. It refers to the component that we are giving access to. Fountains, phones, fire extinguishers, etc., so on and so on. This chapter breaks down the measurements for access to an element. Not specific to drinking fountains, but does pertain to them and a lot of other elements. I don't know why I just did the quotation marks with my fingers, but elements. So you are going to hear these measurements from me at a pretty exhaustive rate for the rest of the webinar because they're very important. So here we go. Clear floor space is a very important measurement and must be met for either a forward or parallel approach, and you must provide 48 inches by 30 inches clearance to an element, whatever that element is. I'm going to repeat that about 100 times before the end of the webinar. You can see in the illustrations above, this is an example of forward and parallel approaches. The drawing on your screen is an example from the Access Board website and draws a pretty clear picture of how floor space for forward and parallel approach can be accomplished. In this example, our elements are a phone and a fire extinguisher. And like I said, not just pertaining to drinking fountains. Now our 30 by 48 inches covers room for a wheelchair, but when the space they're trying to access is in an alcove, we need to provide additional maneuvering clearance for the wheelchair, so that they can angle themselves into the alcove or easily reach the wheels on either side of the wheelchair. Now on a forward approach, when the depth of the alcove exceeds 24 inches, the width must be a minimum of 36 inches wide. On a parallel approach where the depth exceeds 15 inches, the alcove must be 60 inches wide minimum. And again, that's just for maneuverability and to make it as accessible as possible. There are several states that require an alcove for the installation of drinking fountains to remove them from the pedestrian walkway, quite a few. Two prominent states requiring this are California, of course, and Texas as well. This is 306.2 and 3. This gives us the clearance heights for knees and toes, knees and toes, knees and toes, and I'm pretty sure I should have kept that joke to myself. In this illustration, you can see that our 30 by 48 inches is more of a box extending up from the surface of the floor of the user. Okay, from the finished surface of the floor up, whatever it is that they're standing on or sitting on. And this is more of a box, okay? So it requires our floor space and then 9 inches of clearance for the user's toes underneath the element and another 27 inches of clearance for their knees underneath the element. I'll give you some examples of obstructions a little later on the presentation. Anything protruding into this yellow highlighted area on your screen would be considered an obstruction. Okay, and Samantha, if you would launch poll question number 2, please. And again, we really appreciate your participation.
Thanks, Justin. We'd like to know which brands do you specify most or have in your facility? Haws, LK, Halsey Taylor, Oasis, or none of the above? Great, thank you, everybody.
All right, moving on. This is it's a breakdown of elements installed on the walls of a corridor. Can be installed in a way so as not to impact people traveling through the area. This applies to everyone, but primarily, as you can see, is a requirement in place to assist people with a vision impairment. Elements with their leading edge, and which is typically the lowest point on the front of the element, more than 27 inches above the ground, and not more than 80 inches above the ground, may protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel. 27 inches or less is considered detectable by a cane, according to the DOJ. Let me break this down for you. On the left of this illustration, you can see an object squarely within the 27 to 80 inch range. And to prevent running into these objects, it can only protrude 4 inches. There's an exception to this for handrails. They can protrude 4.5 inches. On the right, you have an object with its lower leading edge protruding into the 27-inch area, which is detectable by a cane and can protrude any amount because it can be detected with a cane. You have another object on the right above the 80-inch minimum and again can protrude any amount because they are above what is considered headroom clearance. So if you're 6'8" or taller, you're gonna have a pretty rough time out there. This guy is like Tom Cruise size, so he's good to go. Now, when drinking fountains are involved, our leading edge is going to be right at 27 inches, and with a high-low installation, we accomplish compliance by using our SK3 cane skirt, as you can see in the illustration. So to lower the high side leading edge to 27 inches above the ground, and now it complies with 307.2. This photo is a really good example of what your typical ADA compliant installation is going to look like. This is our high polish unit, primarily used in customer facing high traffic areas. In section 308, it covers reach ranges. Another important requirement when something like a bottle filler is installed or when things like baby changing stations are installed. This slide is pretty straightforward. If unobstructed, like on the left, you have a 48-inch max reach height and a 15-inch minimum. So when your reach is obstructed, for example, reaching over a drinking fountain to access like a bottle filler, your reach max is 48 inches. And our low reach range disappears because we now have an obstruction in our way. So when the element's leading edge is at 20 to 25 inches from the wall, our reach maximum lowers to 44 inches, and that's because we're reaching further. Again, pretty straightforward here. This is one of the easiest illustrations to explain. Section 308 includes a DOJ advisory regarding additional elements and their reach ranges. It also has a chart that covers children's use reach ranges in a pretty easy to use table. It includes age ranges and their requirements for their age. This is common in daycares and in schools. As you can see, ages 3 and 4, we have a 36 and 20 inch high-low. 5 to 8, 40-inch and 18-inch high-low, and then 9 to 12, 44-inch and 16-inch. And again, in the ADA, children are described as 12 and under. In Chapter 6, we get into specifics regarding public elements and measurements. First, in 602.2 regarding clear floor space, facilities are required to have the element, the drinking fountain, positioned for a forward approach, and an important factor to remember is that the ground space needs to be centered on the unit. This is a really, really important thing to remember. That floor space has to be centered on the low side fountain. There is an exception for a parallel approach for units intended for children's use as knee clearance diminishes the closer we install this to the ground. But I'll go over that as well. This illustration gives you a much better idea of how the floor space is to look. You can see that it's centered on each of the elements. And since the floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it's centered on the low side fountain. Some make the mistake of centering the floor space on the center of the fountain between the drinking fountains, which would lead to a tear out, and it may not provide enough space for someone to approach. So remember that box or space needs to be centered on that low side fountain. We do have a generally accepted floor space for standing, stooping persons for the high side, but I'll go over that a little bit later. So as you can see here, we have a total width of 48 inches in this alcove. It is not deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand our 30-inch floor space width for wheelchair. You will notice, however, that it shows a separate measurement for California. In typical fashion, California strayed from standard requirements and mandated an additional 2 inches of floor space. So we go from 30 inches to 32 inches requirement in alcoves in California. To perfectly center the fountain in the alcove, which isn't mandatory, but we would need 48 inches total width of the alcove in California and 46 inches pretty much anywhere else. If the alcove was deeper than 24 inches, remember we would need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance centered on the low side. Okay, center line to center line, these fountains are separated by about 16 inches, almost exactly. which means we would need an additional 18 inches of space on either side total to meet our 36-inch minimum for the floor space and for the fountain to be centered on the low side. Since there's no obstruction under the high side fountain, our primary concern is that wall. If it is at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned, or the fountain moved over so that the high side is closer to the alcove, which may not be as aesthetically pleasing, but it would be compliant since the ADA doesn't give us floor space dimensions for the high side of the fountain. But we need to remember that this site is for those of us with stooping disabilities. So we need to leave room for walkers, canes, and other devices that might be used, etc. Okay, and Samantha, poll question number 3, please.
What is the most important benefit to you or your clients? Quality and aesthetics, low price, minimal maintenance required, or ease of access for things such as filter replacements or cartridge replacements, availability of product, or ADA compliance. You can select all that apply. Thank you for responding.
Okay, back to it. This on your screen is an excerpt from the California Building Code. And what they have done, along with Texas and several other states, is that they have made it mandatory to locate all drinking fountains in alcoves or within wing walls to ensure that they don't impede into pedestrian walkways. I think this is a smart move. I kind of appreciate this. It might be more of a pain in the design process and stuff like that, but I think it's important. The alcove must be a minimum of 32 inches wide. Remember California's floor clearance guidelines, and at least 18 inches deep. If careful attention isn't paid to these installation requirements, it can mean some expensive tearouts, redesigns, and then of course labor to bring it back into compliance. So let's get into a couple examples of this. So someone should have watched our webinar. Alcoves are generally the issue when we see non-compliance problems. In this installation, we have the low side drinking fountain installed on the right side, which isn't a big deal. It can be installed on either side, but our clear floor space and toe clearance is obstructed now. By what I'm told is a gas line, pretty sure it's a gas line. I could argue that if this installation was reversed, that we may not have an issue, but I see another obstruction that may be an issue on the left, depending on how much room we ended up with. Another non-compliant alcove. In this example, the clear floor space is centered on the alcove, which again, I warned you about earlier. So instead of the low side fountain, and it is way too close to the wall. These are 2-inch tiles, and we only have 12 inches on the left low side between the center line and the wall, and 16 inches on the right side. Again, reversing these would probably have been helpful, but we would have that obstruction on the right side for toe clearance. So again, we have 2-inch tiles here. We only have that 12 inches on the left low side, 3 inches short of compliance, 4 inches short for California requirements between the center line and the wall, and the 16 inches on the right side. Again, reversing these probably would have helped. Okay, one more. This example shows a high-low configuration. They're using 4-inch tiles here in the alcove. We can see that to the center line of the fountain, we have only 14 inches. That gives us a total of 29 inches of clearance. Since we still have our 15 inches on the other side, we are only an inch short, technically speaking. We think the issue here is probably that they didn't consider the thickness of the tile when they built the alcove, and the addition of that kind of intruded into our space. Now I'd like to briefly go back to section 602.2 and talk about children's use. This section of 602.2 gives us a maximum bubbler height of 30 inches, a maximum height. So we can go under that, but we cannot exceed that height when it comes to children's use, and a 3.5-inch maximum depth for the bubbler from the front edge of the fountain. So we can't go any deeper than that. They are typically located towards the front of the fountain. This isn't something that's usually an issue, but I suppose it could be. And allows us to forego our previously mentioned knee and toe clearance, 27 inches for knees, 9 inches for toes, so that we can lower the fountain where it is primarily to be used by children, again defined as 12 years of age or younger. And so long as there is space for a parallel approach. Forward approach is typically the preference though. Much of what I'm about to mention depends on your local codes, so be sure to check with local code enforcement before you pull a "well, Haas said so." We still need to adhere to local code. So many states and buildings authorities do not allow for a parallel approach for children's fountains and require a front approach. Some have even specified their own knee clearance, which is fine, but again, make sure you're checking that state code. And now that I have thoroughly confused everybody, let's take a look at some examples so I can help clear that up. Okay, can you spot the problem? There is a lot wrong with this installation. Their intentions were good, I'm sure, but it was to install a high-low fountain with a third child height fountain, which isn't that uncommon. You see a lot of them in airports and schools and things like that, but this installation is backwards. What they've done is installed what should have been the child height fountain at the high fountain height. This is typically an individual fountain, the child height fountain, and use the dual unit on the left as the child and wheelchair accessible fountain. Now the low child fountain is impeding into our 30 by 27 inch clear space under the wheelchair fountain, as you can see by the box on the screen. And since it's a short fountain, even if somebody managed to squeeze in there with a wheelchair, they may not be able to reach the bubbler head since it's not protruding very far from the wall. So many facilities like to install these in like a cascading highest to lowest pattern, but it doesn't matter which side the child fountain goes on, as long as our floor space requirements are being met and the child fountain is spaced far enough away from the wheelchair accessible fountain that, again, it doesn't impede on our clear floor space. This brings us to model 1501 and the 1311. And I will show you an example of how these should be installed to accommodate all persons who may need to use them. So these are going to be my examples here. Okay, so here's what we would do. In this drawing, you can see our 1311 is installed on the left side in a compliant configuration, giving us 27-inch knee clearance. On the right, we have the single 1501 acting as our child height fountain. Our bubbler is positioned just shy of the 30-inch maximum height, and you notice we have extra space between the wheelchair accessible fountain and between the child height fountain on the right side. And I'll explain why that is. Since our wheelchair accessible fountain is in the center of the configuration and needs a 30 by 27 inch clearance underneath it, the children's fountain has to be positioned 22 inches from centerline to centerline from the wheelchair fountain. This extends our floor space out the entire 30 inches, allowing for access and gives us 3 perfectly compliant fountains from an installation standpoint. But just because something is installed correctly doesn't mean it's compliant, right? If our stream height for our bubbler, for our water is off, our alcove depth we're off, etc., we'd still have some problems here. But from an installation standpoint, this is spot on. Our left high side fountain isn't posing any threats to our clearance, and if you were to consider moving the child height fountain, again, if you didn't care about the aesthetic cascading design, to the left side of this diagram, then there would be no need for offsetting the fountain since it wouldn't be anywhere near our wheelchair accessible fountain. and you could save some space on your alcove. Remember, all of this changes a bit when we get into states that require that 32-inch requirement for clearance. These installation requirements can be met using a variety of different products. This one in particular is the Haas model 1107L and consists of heavy-duty vandal-resistant 14-gauge stainless steel, front access cartridge and flow control, and this can be mounted to meet ADA or child specifications pretty easily. Haas plug, you're welcome. Okay, time for some outdoor examples. This is our 3300 FR. It's a freeze protected units, utilizes air activated valves. That's why the buttons looked a little different there. And someone has positioned it way too close to the wall, and it's intruding into our 30 by 48 inch clear floor space. This needs to be moved away from the wall, which is easier said than done. Here's the highlighted area on the ground that needs to be clear for ground clearance, and you can see that the wall is cutting right through that area. The clear floor space is required to be centered on the fountain, and this isn't going to cut it. We may only be off a couple of inches, but remember that close enough doesn't really cut it when it comes to the ADA. If a field inspector were to find this, they could force a tear out and reinstall, which could be costly, time-consuming, labor. All of those things would be factors. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to accessible design. Let's go through another example. What you see here is our 3150. This is an outdoor concrete drinking fountain. A unique feature of this fountain is that the arm can be adjusted for both adult or child height ADA compliance, as these are typically located in parks, which are highly populated by children, you guessed it. It's a very important feature. Now, the approach to these fountains and the direction in which the bubbler head is facing is an important factor for determining how these should be installed in regards to their surroundings in that park. Now, if everyone has been paying attention so far, I'm positive you have been, positive, then you will notice that the above installation is compliant. If the fountain is positioned against a wall, building, railing, whatever, etc., then it must be positioned so that the center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain is a minimum of 15 inches from that wall to accomplish our 30-inch clear ground space. And of course, 48 inches out from the base of the fountain, giving us our clearance underneath the fountain and enough space for the wheelchair. Lastly, it's commonly accepted, like I mentioned before, that I would mention this, but not specified, that a standing or stooping person uses a cane or a walker. It needs about 30 inches of clearance to maneuver and to access the high side easily. Walkers, etc., are usually about 25 inches wide at their base, so 30 inches is a pretty good amount of space for maneuverability, and that's what that 30-inch square is there on that concrete pad. Oh, and remember, there is no exception for outdoor fountains. In California, they would still require your 32 inches of floor space, especially if this was alcoved outdoors. Now, quite frequently in parks and in other outdoor applications, it's really common to see a pad of concrete poured specifically to accommodate a fountain so that they can position it out of the path of travel from other pedestrians. This can cause some issues, though, if the pad is not proportioned correctly or if the fountain is positioned incorrectly. This diagram is just another compliant example. If we're going to accommodate 30 by 48 inches of clearance for our low side fountain and an additional 30 by 30 inch space for the high side fountain, then our total minimum dimensions for the pad comes to 52 inches by 69 inches with the approach from the left side. The low side fountain should be facing the path of travel for the easiest access, but is again something that's not always taken into consideration when somebody's accessing something removed from the pedestrian walkway like this. So we need to make sure that from the path of travel, we're giving as much accessibility to that low side as possible, and we're giving that a solid surface to walk on for those people with stooping issues. If we'd position that on the grass, obviously somebody with a walker or cane might have a little more trouble getting access to that fountain. Now, oftentimes drinking fountains are located in high traffic areas, in parks, near recreational areas, and they can be alcoved using guardrails. And that's to keep the fountain out of the path of travel, and it makes the fountain more easily detectable. Now, all other requirements remain the same for the approach and for the clear ground space. The guardrails need to be long enough to protect the fountain so that no part of the fountain is protruding beyond the guardrails. We want to make sure nobody has any surprises, and we want people to be able to detect those guardrails first. So they need to extend beyond the fountain or at the fountain's depth. This slide, this is just an example of all the various types of fountains that can be used to accomplish compliance or a compliant installation in an outdoor situation. We have a solution for just about any situation, and all of them are highly vandal resistant. We even have dog bowls, so your pup can get a drink. Although not required by the ADA, they are easily my favorite thing ever. This is a newer offering of ours and gives you a modular interchangeable option for your installation. The great part about this fountain is that with our conversation so far, no matter what type of installation or the area, this can be configured pretty easily. Still need to pay attention to the ADA requirements, but it can be configured to give access in most situations, as the components on this can be indexed in any direction. You can put the bottle filler facing any direction you want, the drinking fountains, the bubbler heads, the bowl, all of these things. And it comes with some really great accessories like that dog bowl. Here's an example highlighting the 3600 series. This has over 200 different configurations, again, providing high, low child height installations and a multitude of bottle filler and drinking fountain combinations, configurations. So I just wanted to give you an example of how that would be installed. In January of last year, the ANSI A117.1-2009 standard was given an update. If you didn't know, the ANSI standard was used as a basis for the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. I teach another webinar on Z358.1 for emergency first aid equipment, and A117.1 wins. It took me a little more time to figure that one out. Now, these updates to the ANSI standard included the addition of bottle filling stations to the drinking fountains, section 602, as you can see on your screen. 602.4 is indicating that bottle fillers must adhere to 602.4.1 and .2 regarding clear floor space. So, which again and again and again is 30 inches by 48 inches. I will make sure you never forget that number. And that the controls be either hand operated or automatic, which will also need to adhere to the reach ranges, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. There is also an exception included here that states that if a bottle filler is installed for the high side and for the low side, then the high side bottle filler does not need to comply with this section. But I don't know any manufacturer that's going to provide a different bottle filler design or function-wise for both sides. Now, if a bottle filler is not provided for both fountains, which is generally the case, then the one bottle filler on that high-low must be located on the low side to allow access to wheelchair-bound people. If the bottle filler is on the low side, we can assume both wheelchair-bound and standing persons can access the bottle filler. But if it is installed on the high side, then we wouldn't want to deny anybody because they can't reach it. But providing two is perfectly fine, especially if you have high traffic areas or the fountains are separated, like I said before, on either end of a corridor or something like that. On the screen is our 1920 bottle filler. These easily retrofit onto most drinking fountain installations and are made of 14 gauge stainless steel. And I'm going to use these bad boys to show you how we would install these in a compliant configuration. Here we go. Remember my 1117 LN plug? Yeah, this shows the 1920 installed over our high-low fountain on the low side to make it as accessible as possible. And then depending on how high off the ground this is installed, it could be non-compliant if the installer were to position it too high or too low. But this is generally the configuration that you're going to find it in. These are made of the same 14 gauge stainless steel, and they use that same front access push button as the fountain. So makes it all very easy to maintain from that maintenance standpoint. So in accordance with 308.2.2, you can see that we need to position the bottle filler activation below the required 48-inch maximum height. This one is installed just shy of that requirement at 46 inches. Remember though that this is a maximum height. So the activator can be located anywhere below this height, down to 15 inches without a fountain in place, which is our minimum. And activators should be located above the fountain anyways. So they're typically on the device, but it'd be weird to find one that you could kick or something. As you saw earlier in the presentation, we are allowed to use the 48 inches here because our fountain depth is at 20 inches from the wall. This fountain in particular protrudes 18.5 inches from the wall. If that depth was between 20 to 25 inches though, we would have to decrease our reach range maximum to 44 inches. Do you ever put your hand on your younger sibling's head and push them away so they couldn't reach you when they were trying to get at you? It's a lot like that, but you're thirsty. Here's another example of a compliant configuration. This is the 1920W. I'm sure you can probably guess what the W means. This is installed over our 1501 enameled iron high-low fountain and is really common in school settings. This is a single fountain configuration that could be used as our third child height fountain or with a bottle filler at normal height. But remember, we have different child height reach ranges for different age ranges. So remember that the 30-inch bubbler height is a maximum height. If lowered, we could accommodate child height bottle fillers on the fountains. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so remember for ages 9 to 12, we had a reach range max of 44 inches. So with our bubbler head at 30 inches and our bottle filler at 42 and 5/8 inches, we are in a compliant range for child height requirements. This would be a good setup for a school. Now, if this was all that was available in an adult setting, we would have an issue as our 27-inch knee clearance is now way too low, and our bottle filler would be no longer considered accessible. And one last example of an ADA compliant configuration with a bottle filler. This is our 1920 and a high-low 1011 MS, meeting all accessibility requirements. We also have optional bottle water filters depending on your facility's needs, filtering taste, odor, lead. But I want this image, along with one other I'm going to show you in a minute, to kind of stick in your brain. This is what's required for ADA requirements. We want to make sure that there's the high, the low, we have our clear ground space, we have our bottle filler in an acceptable position and reach range height. So this is typically what you're going to find, especially if you have all three elements on the wall. Here I just wanted to showcase the previous fountain. The only difference here is that we have the HDR8 chiller installed remotely behind the wall with the access panel covering the area and provides fast and easy maintenance, access, and supplies with an obstruction-free approach on our low side for the wheelchair access. And I say the more room, the better. As much room and maneuverability as we can give them is the best. Okay. Lastly, again, we're going to continue with a Q&A section. I have one more poll question for you. But I just wanted to remind everyone that with this photo that our goal today was to arm you with enough information to be dangerous wherever the installation may be in whatever type of facility, from schools to commercial buildings. Please use what you learned here and be champions for compliance. And remember how important it is to provide equal and easy access to drinking fountains and bottle fillers for everybody. Okay. And then Samantha is going to launch poll question number 4.
Great, thanks, Justin. How frequently do you specify or install a bottle filler in addition to a drinking fountain? Great, thank you for your responses. All right, from here we are going to bring Kelly Guilfoy from Specification Sales on the line. We do have a handful of questions from the audience that we'd like to address, as well as a few frequently asked questions. So Kelly, if you are there, we'd like you to answer the questions on the screen. Number 1, does everything have to be ADA accessible?
Well, everything that's offered for use in a building, all building elements of all types, need to be accessible and usable by the disabled. So if you have doorknobs, doorways, cabinet doors, telephones, drinking fountains, anything like that that's accessible to a non-disabled person, it also must be made accessible to the disabled. That's why the high-low drinking fountain really comes into play as the number one requirement. It complies with the minimum requirements of the ADA, and anything that you do after that, of course, is additional. So yes, everything does have to be ADA accessible.
Great. Are children's height fixtures required by the ADA?
Children's height fixtures are not specifically mandated by the ADA, but the ADA does give us a maximum height and reach range requirement for children's fixtures. Most school districts, park districts, and private entities now like Google and Disney studios, people like that are providing childcare facilities within their own corporate offices for their staff. And if you don't take into consideration the safety that is afforded to children by fixtures that they can actually reach, then you're opening yourself up to a liability situation. Most school districts have mandated rules and regulations in their master plans, their school district design guidelines, or their master specifications that require fixtures for children's height.
Great. So now we're going to take some questions from the audience. Dan would like to know, specifically on a prior slide when we were showing our model 3150 outdoor high-low concrete fountain, he was wondering if that concrete bubbler guard would impede the use of the fountain by a wheelchair-bound person.
Now, as long as the water stream is 4 inches high, as required by Chapter 6, then you can comply fully with it. The bubbler guard is there to protect the bubbler from vandalism, but it doesn't impede the user in any way.
Rodney wants to know if a facility has to comply to a remodel. Oh, I'm sorry, does the facility have to remodel in order to comply with ADA?
Well, normally ADA requirements, modernization requirements are triggered by a remodel. There is a 20% cost of the alteration exception allowed by the ADA. So if you're planning a remodel of an existing facility and you had questions about just how much of these ADA requirements you had to comply with, you could qualify for a hardship. Now, that said about modernization and alterations, the other side of this is there is no grandfather clause for the ADA. And if you have facilities that are not accessible to and usable by disabled people, then you are open to be sued by the federal government, by the Department of Justice, for denying accessibility to disabled people. Disabled people have civil rights that are protected by the ADA Act, and you must observe them. So if your facility needs to be altered to meet these requirements, then you would need to alter your facility to meet these requirements.
Elizabeth wants to know where she can get a PDF of the 28 CFR Part 36 standard.
You can download that directly from doj.gov or from access-board.gov. You can get it downloaded as a PDF. It's in printable form or HTML, either way. So yeah, it's available. It's online. It's free.
Guillermo was wondering, for existing facilities not planning to remodel, how many units need to be accessible per floor?
Every floor needs to provide, if every floor is accessible, now there may be floors in a building that for some reason don't have elevator access. The nature of the work that's conducted there is too dangerous for a person in a wheelchair. That happens. There are certain laboratories that can meet that exception. But otherwise, every floor needs to be accessible to and usable by disabled people, just like the able-bodied. Once you have allowed them in, once you've provided them with parking and a path of travel and an elevator, you must also provide for them their restrooms, their drinking fountains, and all the other building elements that might be needed by or used by the disabled person.
Great. Guy wants to know, do drinking fountains installed outside, such as ball diamonds or play areas, do they have to comply with the high-low standards?
Yes, they do. There's specific information in the ADA. Let me see if I can find you a quote. Yeah, section 304. Oh, here, let me know. I'm having trouble locating it at the moment, but basically ball fields are required to be accessible. The stands where people come to view children who might be playing have to be made accessible. Facilities for them, bathrooms, drinking fountains, all of those things that we saw on the accessible path of travel need to be made accessible to those people. Once you're talking about accessibility, you are talking about a high-low feature. You don't have to put them together. You can have a high drinking fountain here and a low drinking fountain some 25 feet, 50 feet away. But the distance away should not be excessive. The disabled person should not have to struggle to travel any further than an able-bodied person to get a drink of water.
If restaurants are not required to have drinking fountains, where can we find the code that explains that?
You know, that's a new one for me. I'm not sure where that came from, actually. Normally, a lot of restaurants don't have drinking fountains within them because they'll serve you a glass of water. However, the building and the path of travel to the restaurant is not exempted from that just because there is a restaurant serving glasses of water. So if you have a typical mall scenario where you have multiple restaurants, you still have to have ADA accessible drinking fountains on the paths of travel that lead to those restaurants.
Does an automatic bottle filler with no push button still need to comply with the reach ranges?
Yes, absolutely. So take, for example, a sensor operated bottle filler. Your typical method of operating that would be you'd hold the bottle in your hand, you reach up under the nozzle, the sensor registers your hand is in position to fill the bottle and turns it on. That sensor should not be any higher than 48 inches for general ADA applications. If you wanted to make that more usable by children, then you could lower that to 44.
Let's see. Is there a specific location within a facility where the drinking fountains are to be located?
Yes, as stated before, the ADA is very specific about paths of travel and accessible routes. They're also referred to. So a path of travel is the general application for the term. It becomes an accessible route once you have installed accessible bathrooms, accessible entrances and exits, accessible doorways, and accessible drinking fountains. As we saw on our list, it's number 5 on the list.
Within ADA, are we permitted to use side guardrails to create alcoves for drinking fountains?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it's very common to see guardrails used to alcove drinking fountains in play areas and ball fields, especially in ball field areas where each field the trend today is every field needs to have a drinking fountain, accessible drinking fountain, high-low facilities, because otherwise the people in this ball field would have to cross over into somebody else's game, and the distance may be an unreasonable expectation for a disabled person. Where we have chain link fencing making up the partitions of these fields, then handrails become the obvious means of creating an alcove, alcoving a drinking fountain. One thing about them is you do have to have a horizontal bar on that guardrail so that the cane can find that guardrail assembly. That horizontal bar is typically 6 to 7 inches above the finished ground, the finished grade level, or the finished floor.
Perfect. Mark wants to know, do offices or places of business have to have a drinking fountain, or is a water bottle dispenser okay?
A water bottle dispenser does not replace an ADA accessible drinking fountain. The ADA specifically describes the drinking fountain. It has to have a bubbler head that's not higher than 36 inches above the finished floor. It creates a stream that's 4 inches high so that you can insert a cup underneath it. It has to have knee space underneath it and protrude, 18 inches so that you can slide the wheelchair, your legs in a forward approach. There's no way to apply those dimensions to a bottle filler. A bottle filler is an accessory. It's an extra to, once you have accomplished ADA accessibility as prescribed by the ADA, then you can add bottle fillers, you can add additional drinking fountains and additional drinking stations.
Thank you, Kelly. We're going to take one more question, and then the next slide will have contact information for you guys as well, so hang tight. Is there a specific requirement for the type of actuation of a drinking fountain or water cooler? For example, push button, lever, or sensor?
No, actually, the ADA requires only that there be no twisting of the wrist or grasping of the hand. You should be able to either push the button, press down on a lever, or activate a sensor operated mechanism. It doesn't make a preference.
Great. So that's all the time we have for questions. Justin, do you want to get to the next slide? We'll talk about some contact information. One thing I did want to mention to everybody while they're on the line, Haas did just come out with a master spec document for drinking fountains that can be found on our website, haasco.com, under the support tab under spec tools. So that can be easily downloaded and utilized as an up-to-date master specification for drinking fountains.
And I'd like to just say on behalf of myself and Kelly, Samantha, and everybody who was a part of this, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We do a lot of work to put as much accurate information into this as possible and make it worth your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and then please look forward to more webinars from us in the future. Thank you.